This is very much a work in progress, this paper, and I'm using the notion of affect for the first time ever in this paper. Well, for me, ever in this paper, and it's also the first time that I've spoken about affect publicly. So it's somewhat daunting for me, but I get a sense that it is an important concept, and if there is something called affective theory or affect theory, I think there is something important that we need to struggle with to try and get at racialization in the context of debates about migration. And that's partly the inspiration behind the paper. So whiteness in the state of arrest, the effective logic of whiteness and the climate change migrant. Postcards from the Future is a collection of magical realist photography which was exhibited at the Museum of London and later at the National Theatre in 2010-2011. Those are the images from Postcards from the Future. So, and some of them I'm going to show up here. I don't have the PowerPoint, unfortunately, but I'll just scroll through the website and show you some of them. It was comprised of 16 large format backlit transparencies, all of which sought to depict London under conditions of climate change. In one image, Buckingham Palace is engulfed by a sea of shanties. That's the image that Giovanni showed earlier. In another, the double glazing in London's famous Gherkin is draped with drying laundry. I shall try and call it up here. There it is. In a third, Parliament Square, which was the initial image that I showed you, in a third, Parliament Square is transformed into a rice paddy, worked on by hunched-over laborers and yoked water buffalo. And in a fourth image, a family of Jaipur monkeys overlook the flooded Thames from their rooftop, from the refuge atop St. Paul's. The other 12 images are equally provocative. Race is nowhere stated in these images, and yet they scream race. The icons of Britishness, of whiteness, monarch, capital, parliament, and church, overrun by hordes of nameless climate migrants, the third world other inhabiting the ruins of post-imperial Britain. These are arresting images, perhaps so because they hold a particular form of British whiteness in a state of arrest. My contention is that by visualizing or premediating the future, these images signal a rather unique racial ontology at play in the cultural context of climate change. This is an ontology with a distinctive spatiotemporality in which race and whiteness might be said to emerge from or be distilled out of an affective relation. An ontology that emerges from the conjunction of the actual, what is now, and the virtual, what, for example, what could be. I'll say more about the dynamics of this racial ontology in just a moment. But for now, what I would like to claim is that by premediating, and I'll explain that term in a moment, premediating, that by premediating the apparent social transformations that climate change is said will bring about, these images, as well as the wider discourse on climate change and migration with which they resonate, generate a particular orientation to the phenomenon of climate change. An orientation which I describe here as one of white affect. Understanding this affectivity, acknowledging its effects and so forth is crucial if we're to appreciate not simply how prior racial taxonomies are reproduced in climate change discourse, but also how climate change gives rise to an altogether new ontology of race. And this is, I think, partly getting at what Arun was suggesting earlier. My aim for this paper then is to sketch out what I think are the lineaments of this racial ontology and its relation to climate change governance. By establishing white affect as my theoretical point of departure, I need to be very clear that my argument does not so much depart from, but rather seeks to add to the dominant way of conceiving race as an affective language or as a dialectical process of signification. So whereas it's commonplace in cultural studies to argue that race has no ontology apart from its performative, repetitive force and the citationary structures that are said to produce it, my argument owes more to Arun's work, Arun's observation, which is that, quote, white racism needs to be conceived as a system of involving not just exclusion, but more complex shades of differentiation and interaction prior to any distinction between self and other, East and West. In other words, my argument proceeds from the observation that race and whiteness have an ontology prior to their representation, an ontology perhaps best described as affective. By affective, I mean that this is a racial ontology that is not a specifiable thing, not a specific historical determination, nor a specific object of analysis, but an intensity, a relation between motion and rest, the actual and the virtual, a relation between process and its cessation. This is a relation that sits outside material social orderings and yet remains fundamental to the material as its immaterial counterpart. So it's not the world, but it is adjunct to it, as it were. So more than simply an argument about climate change and migration, this paper also aims to contribute to wider debates about the persistence of race thinking and white supremacy the world over. In particular, it insists that affect can partly explain white supremacy precisely because affect does not need to be spoken in order for it to have an effect. Affect can help to explain how racist sensibility can be mobilized without the vocabulary of race ever being mentioned. In other words, white affect can set in motion, can be set in motion, can be mobilized, cultivated, and modulated for very specific political purposes. For example, to promote a particular racial imaginary of the world. Or in slightly different terms, affect can be deployed and worked on as an expression of white racial authority. And in this sense, what I'm suggesting is that if we examine white affect in the context of debates about climate change and migration, if we examine how white affect manifests specific material circumstances, security technologies, for example, border fortification, but also climate change adaptation, and even heteronormativity, again, that question of sex comes up, and hopefully I'll get to it at the end. We might begin to see how the discourse of climate change and migration is held together not by a specific ideological form, militarism, for example, a la the kind of fear narratives that Giovanni was speaking about earlier, the Malthusian narratives, or liberalism, the more recent iteration of climate and migration discourse around migration as a positive adaptation response. So we might begin to see how the discourse is held together not by a specific ideological form, militarism or liberalism, but by an affective logic of white supremacy that cuts across or moves between and permeates these ideological expressions. So the paper begins with a short introduction into debates that currently surround climate change and migration. The paper then uses affect theory, at least my minimal reading of affect theory, to argue that the recent groundswell of interest in climate change and migration can be better explained as a manifestation of white affect, more so than as a problem of human rights, state sovereignty, adaptation, and development. So, climate change and migration. Migration is by now a standard element in climate change discourse. So let me just quickly highlight three important aspects of the discourse that I think will be pertinent for the discussion later on. The first of these concerns the way in which the figure of the climate change migrant, but also the climate refugee, the environmental refugee, environmental migrant, and so forth, is said to pose some sort of threat to established forms of social order. Predictably then, the figure of the climate migrant, like any migrant, is regularly figured as alien to some already apparently cohesive social body. Consequently, what this means is that the expression of future disorder, as the expression of future disorder, we might understand the climate migrant as the always present potential excess of the state, that which always potentially exceeds the social determinations that the state is empowered to police and to regulate. The second aspect of the discourse on climate change and migration that I think is important concerns its temporality. I've already said something about this already. Almost without exception, the migration effects of climate change are narrated in the future conditional tense. It is a phenomenon that is likely to happen. This is compounded by a related observation, which is that migration is irreducible to environmental factors alone. Environmental factors may contribute to migration decisions, but never determine migration, since migration decisions are always the result of a far more complex set of considerations, such as labor markets, land tenure, and rights. Consequently, this means that identifying someone in the present as a climate migrant is impossible. And in that sense, I like to think of the climate migrant as mercurial, yeah? If you've ever attempted, and I don't advise you to do this at home, but if you've ever attempted to pick up a piece of liquid mercury, it always will escape your grasp, yeah? And yet it's there, it's an object, you can see it, but it will always skirt away from you, and it's kind of that idea that I have in mind when I think about the climate migrant. As a figure that is impossible to grasp. As soon as one tries to label a body a climate migrant, the label cannot hold because so many other intervening variables can also explain one's migration decision. Hence, the only appropriate grammatical or representational form that the discourse on the migration effects of climate change can take is the future conditional. Postcards from the future. Follow up for you. Postcards from the Future exemplifies this point rather well, using the very specific aesthetic form of magical realist photography. Other future conditional representational forms, are also readily found throughout the discourse. We've talked about them already. Quantitative prediction, digital forms of predictive modeling, such as agent-based modeling, statistical regression, and correlation analysis, but also scenario planning, which we see a lot of in sort of military and paramilitary representations, and futures mapping. And a final point about the discourse concerns the migrant's indeterminate quality. If identifying someone as a climate change migrant remains impossible, then this impossibility poses serious difficulties for designating the climate migrant categorically. Put simply, no universal categorical definition exists for a person who has or who may migrate for reasons of climatic or environmental variability. And in this way, the figure of the climate migrant is perhaps best conceived as the excess of categorization. It lacks any precise definition and can therefore never be identified as such. It can only exist as a virtual presence, no less real. It has effects, but never actually materializing, never fully emerging. It's a mythical figure, a kind of imminent guest from the future. In its indeterminacy, it's monstrous. In its indeterminacy, it is monstrous. The figure of excess, the incommensurable. Taking all three aspects together, we might say that the figure of the climate migrant is a disordering, monstrous figure from the future. No surprise then that it is regularly invoked to incite fear amongst various publics for various political purposes. Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth provides an excellent example of this, as does the film Climate Refugees, which carried a very similar set of warnings. Climate change demands our political attention because the consequences of inaction will be socially, politically, culturally, and economically devastating. And I think we could read the same technique at stake in Postcards from the Future. The climate migrant or refugee will catalyze violence or exceed an already overwhelmed system of humanitarian relief. Such texts are very obviously trying to induce fear. However, as academics, I think we need to disaggregate this fear by asking what kind of fear it names. How might this fear be characterized? Betsy Hartman provides one of the clearest clues when she asks why, given the epistemological difficulties of defining the climate migrant, quote, have these narratives gained so much momentum? Part of the reason lies in the way they draw on deep-seated fears and stereotypes of the dark-skinned, overbreeding, dangerous poor. Fear, race, threat, and futurity. This is the stuff of affect theory, which is what I want to talk about now. Premediation, which is a term I mentioned earlier, and affect are two related concepts that can help us better grasp the racial ontology circulating within the wider discourse on climate and migration. And so I'll address each in turn. Premediation is a concept used in media and communication studies to describe a form of American media logic which arose in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and which intensified in the run-up to the US-led invasion of Iraq in March 2003. Coined by Richard Grusin, premediation is the name given to a kind of media logic that actively proliferates the number of possible future scenarios that may arise out of a given situation. The purpose of premediating such futures, mediating them before they occur, is to inure publics to the shock of an event and its multiple aftermaths in advance of their occurrence. In this way, premediation functions as a kind of, in Grusin's terms, affective prophylactic that prepares publics to expect any number of a range of possible futures so as to prevent the experience of a traumatic future, such as violent, aggressive military invasion or an act of terrorism. Grusin documents how the logic of premediation functioned across the various U.S. television networks in the lead-up to the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. He argues that well in advance of the actual invasion, the television networks began to proliferate the number of possible future scenarios that might arise from the invasion. So, for example, there were reports that sought to anticipate what form the invasion would take, how the resulting violence would play out, how Saddam Hussein might respond, what provisional regime would be installed following the ousting of Hussein, and so forth. The effect of such premediation, argues Grusin, is that American media-consuming publics were not only prepared to expect the invasion, but that when the invasion did occur, such publics would not register it as an especially cataclysmic or disruptive event. So too, through premediation, American media-consuming publics were pre-primed to expect any number of outcomes. Again, the effect of which was to deaden whatever shock such publics might otherwise experience in the absence of a fully premediated set of futures. So Grusin conceptualizes premediation as a form of reasoning specific to American media landscapes. But it has also been used to characterize the governing logics of other risk landscapes, including the war on terror and climate change. There are two specific elements of premediative logic that are pertinent for our discussion on the racial ontology at play in discourses on climate and migration. The first of these concerns how, quote, this is quoting Grusin, how premediation entails the generation of possible future scenarios or possibilities, which may come true or which may not, but which work in any event to guide action, to shape public sentiment in the present. End quote. According to Grusin, what matters in premediative logic is not whether the anticipated futures are correct. Premediation is not a form of predictive reasoning. Rather, what matters is that by proliferating possible futures in advance of their occurring, premediation allows for the future to become actionable in the present. I'm going to run out of time. In this sense, premeditation is not concerned. So if the first element of premediation pertinent to our discussion is that it makes the future actionable, the second is that premediation is centrally concerned with managing collective affect in a way that ensures that the future will not be experienced as a disruptive force, but as a fully expected, even logical outcome of the present. So perhaps we can already begin to see how premediation can help us better appreciate the racial ontology at stake in climate migration discourse. As already mentioned, the phenomenon of climate change and migration can only be apprehended empirically through future conditional forms of knowledge. And I've listed some of these. Or to use a far more popular example, Hurricane Katrina provides a recurring point of reference in climate change migration discourse precisely because it provides an example of what we can expect more of under conditions of climate change. Extreme hydrological events that evade predictive reasoning, the economic and political liabilities of which are incalculable. In this sense, premediation is a technique for governing collective affects in anticipation of an event. So the representational schemas of climate change-induced migration tell a story about disordered or chaotic futures, in which, for example, Jaipur monkeys will occupy the seat of the Church of England, or in which Buckingham Palace is engulfed in shanties. Let me turn now to the concept of white affect, which I derive from an engagement with the work of the Canadian cultural theorist, philosopher Brian Massumi. By affect, I refer to an intensity that arises out of the interplay between process and cessation. And by white affect, I refer to an intensity that animates the normal and the ordinary, an intensification or a closing down on the futures available to bodies in a way that confines them to a set of constraints imposed by whiteness. This obviously requires a bit of explanation. So let me start with the relation between process and cessation. Borrowing from Brian Massumi, process is nothing but the imminent and continuous unfolding of the totality of the world. This is a view of the world in which process is given ontological primacy over position. Before position, we have process. A body in process is fully indeterminate. It has no position, but is rather best construed as pure potential. In this sense, a processual body is defined by its capacity to become anything. However, a processual body stops being a processual body the moment it takes up a position, the moment it is established. The moment it is stabilized, the very moment it encounters its own cessation. Again, following Brian Massumi, we might say that positionality is backformed from cessation, backformed against an endpoint. In this sense, when a body is backformed against cessation, it undergoes a qualitative shift from being pure potential to being a determinate body, a positioned body, now defined, fixed, or constrained by a limited set of possibilities. This is not to say that the body stops moving. It is simply to say that the body's movement is no longer defined by its infinite variability. Rather, the body's movement is now defined by an affective relation between what the body is, black, white, gay, straight, man, woman, and so on, and what it might become, between its actual and virtual or corporeal forms. Backformed against cessation, the body shifts from being a body in process to an intensive body. It moves from being a body marked by its potentiality or infinite variability to a determinate body unfolding within a rigid framework of possibilities. Okay, so that's enough about affect. I realize I'm going to run out of time, but if you'll just give me a page, yeah? I just want to get to, bring these concepts to bear on climate. Now, what I would like to suggest is that through the issue of climate change and migration, we might begin to see how white affect is central to the way in which climate change is premediated and thus governed. Three governing logics evident in the debate about climate change and migration. One is a form of militarism in which the migrant is figured as threat against which one must be secured. Border fortification and overt militarism are its technologies. Another is a form of liberal security in which the migrant is constructed as a potentially legitimate adaptation response to climate change. Resilience, risk management, adaptation policy are its technologies. And a third is the adoption of clean energy technologies aimed at mitigating climate change before its radical social transformations materialize. I would suggest that while these are specific yet very different manifestations of the perceived need to control the migrant as other, common across all of them is an affective orientation to the future, in which white authority is imagined as a form of power that cannot be guaranteed. Consequently, all three manifestations, militarism, liberalism, and what I'm calling mitigationism, for lack of a better word, are forms of relations that are particular material configurations that derive from the intensity of white affect, that are distilled out of the relation between movement and cessation. Moreover, both promise to maintain the primacy of white authority, all three promise to maintain the primacy of white authority in the face of its apparent demise. And in this sense, both condition or close down the potentialities available to all bodies in the context of climate change. The white subject can assume either a defensive posture, which restricts entry, the other's entry, or it can admit or accommodate the other, providing the other meets a set of conditions which ensure that white authority is not undermined. Or it can install renewable energy technologies. All three orientations, as specific material manifestations of white affect, however, close down the body's potential for infinite variability by restricting the overflowing potential that characterizes life. And so if the migration effects of climate change generate an affective orientation to the future that confines climate adaptation to a limited range of possibilities, how might we reactivate potential as a life force conducive to a politics of climate change? And for this, and by way of a conclusion, let me briefly turn to Ben Zietland's brilliant science fiction climate change survivalist film, Beasts of the Southern Wild, just to show of hands if you've seen the film. Yeah, it's quite a good film. I really enjoyed it. The film tells the story of a 5-year-old black girl called Hush Puppy, who along with her father Wink and their rebellious, alcoholic, unruly comrades, both black and white, live illegally on a piece of land called the Bathtub, on the wrong side of the levee that separates the bayou from the anodyne world of southern Louisiana. Hush Puppy, Wink, and their motley band live a kind of irreverent anti-authoritarian wildness that actively resists capture from the health authorities that symbolize sanitized white America. They live on catfish, crab, stolen liquor, and when the storm comes and the bathtub floods, they seek refuge in makeshift rafts until the floodwaters recede. Although I'm critical of Zietland's casual celebration of the triumph of resilience in the face of adversity, and the way that triumph of resilience in the face of adversity gets indigenized, if you will. The bathtub's unruly inhabitants are brilliant in their refusal of anodyne white America, in favor of a world of unbounded creativity, ungovernability, and excess. This is a fugitive world defined as much by escape as by its potential to combine with itself, to forge new ways of life that open out onto the world. This is a world of self-organization that lived deliberately as an act of political rebelliousness. I'll end there. That's, what I'm onto then at the very end here is not unlike what Julian is trying to do with Olivier Messiaen, and just sort of celebrating an affirmative politics of combination rather than, a reactive politics that seeks to mitigate against combination. So, thank you. Sorry for taking